Have you ever witnessed injustice unfold right before your eyes? A racist police officer assumes that a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the lush greenery. He turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. The park was one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in a bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job. Today, though, his thoughts were interrupted. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind, he knew the city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred, a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. A black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed, suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts. "Never seen him around here before," Brian muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead, but it was enough for Brian. Can you imagine the tension building in this moment? Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered as he started walking towards Marcus, his posture stiffening with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine how it played out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench, his tone polite but with an edge to it. Marcus could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book. He was fishing for something, anything to justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying, in what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus didn't move. He held Brian's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it, but admitting that would mean losing face, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Marcus knew he could push back, could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make this situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Marcus handed over his ID, Brian snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter, he'd already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly but did as he was told, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give in to anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him stop now. He grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him towards the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself, he knew who he was, knew that this officer would find out soon enough. But he couldn't help but feel a deep weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that, despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people like Officer Brian Harkins. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside, the tension still hanging in the air. Marcus settled into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkin drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something Brian didn't. It gnawed at him, made him question his instincts. But his pride wouldn't let him admit that. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful, but he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, an authority that Officer Harkin had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool, controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, and Brian parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into Marcus's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air, officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. Marcus noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away in his mind. The recognition was subtle, but it was there. Someone in this precinct knew who he was. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said as he handed the ID back to Brian. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian stiffened slightly. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but he didn't have a choice. "All right," Brian said, his voice tight. He turned to Marcus, his grip firm on Marcus's arm. "Let's go." Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable, as they approached Captain Bennett's office. He could sense the tension in Brian, the uncertainty that the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Marcus noted it with quiet satisfaction. Brian knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice from inside. The office was neat, organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. "Officer Harkin," she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspiciously, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition, just like Jenkins, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. "Is that so?" she said, her voice even. Marcus met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. "That's right," Brian continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Marcus and Bennett. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. "He wouldn't cooperate, Captain," he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Brian carefully. "Officer Harkin, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone." Brian blinked, taken aback by the request. "But, Captain, outside, Harkins," Bennett said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Marcus nodded. "Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Bennett assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Harkin and deal with this appropriately. But I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Bennett considered his words, then nodded in understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Bennett stood up. "I'll call Officer Harkin back in. We'll resolve this." Marcus nodded again, watching as Captain Bennett moved to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Harkin would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for," Bennett said. "You'll release him immediately." Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What?" "But, Captain, immediately, officer," Bennett repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Brian hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Brian swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss." Captain Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Davis." With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there with a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Brian Harkins sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Davis. The unease gnawed him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. Brian's stomach tightened, he knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Harkins, my office, now," Captain Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his. "Officer Harkin," she began, her tone measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," Bennett said, her voice firm. "And more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent, no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Harkins," Bennett replied, her tone still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Brian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. What happens now? Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, up to and including termination. Brian's heart sank. Termination, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his job, his career, was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. I understand, Captain, Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. I know this isn't easy to hear, Harkin, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions. Brian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now, all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain, he said, his voice trembling, I suppose this is it then? Bennett nodded, her expression softening further. It doesn't have to be the end, Brian. You can still choose to grow from this, to make changes in your life. But that's up to you. Brian stood there for a moment, as if considering her words, before giving a brief nod. I'll think about it, he paused, then added, good luck, Captain, and to you as well, Mr. Davis. With that, Brian turned and left the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Bennett and Marcus watched him go, both lost in their thoughts. Do you think he'll be okay? Marcus asked after a moment. Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. I hope so, but it's out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work in front of us. Marcus nodded in agreement. And there's plenty of that. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Marcus stood, extending his hand to Bennett. Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right. Bennett shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Davis. Your involvement has been invaluable. We're in this together. With that, Marcus turned and left the office, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, but he also knew that it was necessary. The events of the past few weeks had opened a door, and it was up to all of them to walk through it. As Marcus stepped out into the cool morning air, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through with renewed determination. Marcus walked away from the precinct, his mind already turning to the next steps in his work. There was so much more to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he would be there to help guide it every step of the way. Don't forget to like, share this powerful story with your friends, and subscribe to Dark Threads to never miss more thought-provoking content like this. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.